Muito bom dia a todos os participantes, sejam bem-vindos à SPM. Este evento temos o privilégio de sediar no PPG-Com, que é o Programa de Pós-Graduação em Comunicação e Práticas de Consumo da SPM e do Media Lab, que conta com a participação do professor Daniel Miller, do professor Alfonso Otaegui e da professora Marília Duque. Gostaria de pedir a todos os participantes que mantenham os seus microfones fechados durante as apresentações. Este evento ele será feito parte em português, parte em inglês. Então, é um pouco esquizofrênico. Eu espero não ficar lost in translation, starting one phrase in Portuguese and ending in English. It is exactly what is going to happen, and it's happening right now. So I just very briefly, I want to say very warmful thanks for Professor Daniel Miller for the opportunity to present his news book, as well as the results of his research with us. So, apenas para apresentar, sem mais delongas, o professor Daniel Miller é professor de antropologia na University College London, author and editor of 41 books, including Como o Mundo Mudou as Redes Sociais, Trecos, Troços e Coisas, e Teoria das Compras. He led with the Why We Post project, whose 11 books have now passed over 1 million downloads, at the Anthropology of the Smartphone and Smart Aging as a project. His work was recently discussed in a special issue of Revista Sociologia and Antropologia. I will post later the book of the results of this research to be downloaded freely on the chat. Alfonso Otaegui is completed his PhD in social anthropology and ethnography at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris. He spent a year as a postdoc at the University of California, Berkeley, and then 2 years as a Humboldt Fellow at the Philipps Universität Marburg in Germany. As a research, Alfonso carried out 16 months of ethnography fieldwork among Peruvian migrants focused on communicative practice related to aging and healthcare in new digital environments. He also carried out fieldwork among older adults adopting new technologies and is currently developing digital alphabetization initiatives in further applied anthropologist projects. Marília Duque completou o doutorado no programa de pós-graduação em Comunicação e Práticas de Consumo da SPM, com uma tese sobre smartphones, aging and health. Como membro da pesquisa do ASA Research Team, ela fez parte do trabalho dela de campo em São Paulo. Ela é membro também, membro do Grupo de Pesquisa Ética, Comunicação e Consumo, certificado pelo CNPq, e co-editora do Observatório Ética de Bolso. Marília também é autora dos protocolos de guias de boas práticas para a utilização de WhatsApp em saúde, protocolos para clínicas e hospitais, e também o protocolo WhatsApp aplicado à nutrição, protocolo para registro alimentar visual, com o uso de aplicativos de mensagem. A Marília é Research Assistant na University College of London and Department of Anthropology e também pesquisadora associada do Media Lab SPM. Sem mais delongas, I would like to say thank you again for everybody. And please, Professor Daniel Miller, I would say to you that the floor is yours, but there's no floor. So the audience is all yours. Please feel welcome at ASPM.
Okay, well, the Zoom is mine. So thank you very much for the invitation. Bon dia, and I'm delighted to be presenting, especially in this context of SPME, because Actually, I have quite a good relationship now for some time. The first time I came to Brazil, it was the invitation, SPM, and also more recently, João Mata, who is with you, he was very generous in translating the volume from Wiley Post, How the World Changed Social Media, and we are very grateful to him. More recently, the Brazilian member of that team, the excellent Juliana Speyer, has a new book out on Pentecostals. And last week, we heard that one of my Brazilian PhD students, Carol, she has just been appointed as a lecturer in my department. And actually, you may be particularly interested because it's a lectureship in anthropology and enterprise and the links between them. So the project I've come to speak about, we've all come to speak about, is this project that we call ASA. And I'm going to just quickly share a PowerPoint with you, which I hope you can now see. And ASA stands for the Anthropology of Smartphones and Smart Aging. And it consisted of 11 researchers working in 9 countries. Very briefly, you have Laura Happier-Kirk working on 2 sites in Japan, Xinyuan Wang working in Shanghai amongst middle class. We have a Palestinian and an Israeli Jew working together, actually on a Palestinian community in Al-Quds in East Jerusalem. We have Charlotte Hawkins working in a low-income area of Kampala in Uganda, with Patrick Owanda working in a more middle-class site in Yaoundé, the capital of Cameroon. In Ireland, there were 2 sites, Pauline Garvey and myself, similar ethnographies carried out simultaneously. I plan to work in Trinidad in the future, but today you're going to hear mainly from the 2 sites in Latin America, essentially Marilia working in Sao Paulo and Alfonso working in Chile. Now, the topic of the project was always really around the connection between 3 issues. One was aging, and one was smartphones, and the third was health. I'm going to concentrate really on what we found out about the smartphone, re-understanding the smartphone, the little bit about aging as the context. I won't be talking about health because that side of the project is going to be the subject of the talks by Alfonso and Marilia. Right, so if you look at this slide, you can see that one of the reasons we wanted to work on aging was because the smartphone until very recently was seen as a youth technology, but it was really the first time that it could now be seen as everybody's technology, because a lot of the increase recently has been with older people. But the experience of aging itself has radically changed in many regions of the world. So we decided to concentrate on people we would who regard themselves really neither as particularly young nor particularly old. And with growing life expectancy, that may be the group that has experienced particularly these changes. And as examples, in many societies, traditionally, rather like in our case in Al-Quds, when people reached a certain age, they sort of saw themselves as old or senior. They maybe changed their clothing and manner to reflect that. But now a lot of that has kind of fallen away. In my site, people typically would say, oh, I thought I would feel old when I became 50, 60, 70, 80, but it just didn't happen. And there's much more this sense of sort of continuity with youth, until usually there are issues of frailty, and then people obviously have to contend with that. So it's this broad group that really is the context of our studies. Essentially, what then do you learn from trying to understand what a smartphone is when concentrating on sort of all adults, not just kind of youth? And what I'm going to do is give a series of brief kind of generalizations about the sort of main conclusions. But the starting point, I guess, was that it didn't help that it was called the smartphone, because phoning is really such a small part of what actually people do with this device. So to kind of change our perspective, to get us kind of rethinking about it, we sort of started with a hypothesis, which then very much was concurred with by our evidence, that maybe it's better to think about the smartphone as a place within which we live. And as you can see in this kind of infographic, That means, for example, you can imagine it as having sort of different rooms. There's, a place where you socialize with other people. There's a place where you're watching football. There's a place where you're organizing your work or doing your research and so forth. Or equally, you can say, well, it's our home in the sense that it's probably now our main address. I mean, people might be concerned whether you are in your bricks and mortar home if they want to call round, but mostly they're concerned with whether you're at home, meaning they can contact you inside the smartphone home. And indeed, many people in our field sites did use these domestic analogies themselves. There was a lovely quote from one of Patrick's research participants in Cameroon, who was saying, okay, I'm so fed up, I am not going to let this person into my home again. But he was talking about his smartphone. So it's kind of not just us who are tending to kind of think that way. There's the phone, the home part of it. Of course, there's also the portal part of it in the transportal home, because the other capacity of the phone is that you can be at home, but then immediately, without taking a car or a bus, be inside somebody else's smartphone home. So you might be an older couple, say in Shanghai, and then you're in contact with your son in Beijing. He sends you some photos and you want to share that with your sister in another Chinese town. So all these households, in a sense, portaling together and sort of uniting through the device. Now, we're anthropologists, so we always feel uncomfortable making with a generalization at that level. And in every case, and this is the only time I'll have to do it because it's a short presentation, we then say, okay, you make that point, but it's going to differ according to which population you're talking about. So briefly, you could say, oh, okay, for young people, this matters because, like in England, a lot of young people, they can't now afford their own home like their parents did. They're living inside their parents' home and they don't want to be. So there, the smartphone is like a private home for them within the kind of wider home. For older people, it's completely different. They may be feeling immobile or have problems, or simply that they now worry about, going out at night. They're fearful, they're anxious about this. And then the smartphone is important because of the transportal element. Even without going out, they can still feel connected with family and friends, etc., during that evening when they didn't want to go out. A third example is two of our sites, including Alfonso's, are concentrating on migrants. And migrants are a community where there's always been an issue of, is it the family and the friends back in the place that I come from, where I lived, or what about the ones who are living in the place where I now live? But in the smartphone home, there is no difference. They all come together in the same place. So we make the generalization and then we try and bracket it with all these different instances in each different region. Another such generalization would be that for a long time with these internet and other devices, people have talked of the death of distance, meaning it doesn't matter if somebody is next door or the other side of the world. When they're on your phone, it's the same. But what we worked out was that the smartphone changes your perception of the world around you much more generally. And it's what we call perpetual opportunism, because if you have your phone with you all the time, then there is always the opportunity to use its various capabilities wherever you might be. Sorry, that was perpetual opportunism. I switched. Death of proximity. Death of proximity is actually the complement to the death of distance, because it's about the fact that you might be going to a restaurant together and you think you're together, you've come in order to have a meal together. But then after 5 minutes, somebody takes out their phone and they're ignoring you. They're just not there. They might be communicating with somebody else, they might be doing something else, but they're no longer in your presence in the same way. And this is something that really has come up with the smartphone, and that's why we call it the death of proximity. Next big generalization, the smartphone. Well, I've said a problem with it being called smart, being called a phone. There's also a problem with it being called smart, because smart tends to think of, oh, the phone is created with algorithms and artificial intelligence, it can predict what you're going to do, and all these kind of qualities. But in our work, we find the consequences of that are slight. Far more important is the open architecture of the phone, which means that actually the smartphone isn't what you get from a shop. It's really what you have adapted and transformed it into being for your purposes in everyday life, by changing content and settings, or simply adding apps. And through that process, we found that actually, perhaps more than any device in history, this allows for a kind of personalization. So a professional woman can have an iPhone that is really like a manual, terribly well organized, reflects her kind of personality. Whereas, a very masculine man who cares about nothing shouldn't be there that isn't functional, he may strip away everything except really what you need the phone to be. And if it can express people in that way, it can express relationships, it can express the cultural values that those people represent. And we call it beyond anthropomorphism because anthropomorphism is looking like. The phone doesn't look like, but it becomes like in quite a profound way. I then already previously talked about this quality of perpetual opportunism. I'll briefly return to it. And you remember I was saying that it was the fact that it was kind of always with you and changed your perception of the world around you. So you see something out there and it looks wonderful. So immediately you can take out the phone, take a picture of it. And because it was wonderful, immediately you want to share it with a friend you know would appreciate it. So you can do it immediately. You're stuck in a queue, doesn't matter. You can look at the news, you can listen to music, you see a notice board, you can record it there and then. So essentially, the idea that you can always be opportunistic with respect to what the phone allows you to do is that quality of perpetual opportunism. Okay, very last generalization I'm going to make is that even before the outbreak of the pandemic, we argued that the smartphone did two interesting things in parallel. One is it increases the capacity for care, and much in our book is about that, and you'll hear more about it later on. But it also simultaneously increases the capacity for surveillance. And that means that people start to be worried about this sort of balance between, on the one hand, care and the one hand, surveillance. Now, that was coming from our work anyway, in talking about how, let's say, people relate to their elderly parents. But once the pandemic hit, our observation, I think, became everybody's observation, because the primary use of smartphones, one of the uses of smartphones under the pandemic has been the development of this track and trace technology. And track and trace technology, where you identify people who are ill in order to warn other people, is that care or is it surveillance? And I think the interesting thing is the technology is pretty much the same everywhere in the world, but the response to it could not be more varied. In Korea, it would largely be seen as, of course, it's care, it saves lives. Whereas I guess for US Republicans, of course, it's surveillance and an intrusion on our privacy and all of these things. And I suppose that brings us back to the anthropological perspective, which is to show that actually it's these cultural values, these moral issues that often determine what happens to the technology. And that will lead on to the further two presentations from Alfonso and Marilia, because they will talk more about the kind of health and applied aspects, which was always the intention of our work, that we weren't just going to write about the smartphone, we would also try and see ways in which understanding its use for health could be employed. And as in this care and surveillance, it's also understanding our project as comparative. You need to see how it works in these different regions. And I think Alfonso and Marilia will be, in fact, talking about each other's region as well as their own. So to conclude, there are 3 books already available. They're free, they're downloads. They include films within them. The Global Smartphone is the comparative book. The good news there is that it will soon be available in Portuguese, we hope in a few months. There's also books in Italy, there's also books in Ireland, and others will follow. And if you want to meet the rest of the team, apart from us three, I just wanted to conclude by saying there is a launch event on the 26th. You can go to Eventbrite and you can get, it's free, you can get tickets, and then you can meet us all. And if you have questions for the team, you can ask any of us. So I had to talk quite fast given the time, but I hope that conveyed something. So thank you very much again for giving me this opportunity. Can you?
And thank you, Professor Daniel Miller. Let's going to move forward. So we will have time for questions by the end. So now, Professor Alfonso Otaegui diria também a mesma coisa. Seja bem-vindo. Lhe passo a palavra.
Muito obrigado. Vou compartilhar minha tela. Então, lá. Estão conseguindo ver?
Sim.
Perfeito. Vou começar então. Bom dia. Em primeiro lugar, queria agradecer à SPM e a Marília Duque pelo convite e pela organização do evento. Hoje vou compartilhar parte do meu trabalho dentro do projeto ASA. A partir da minha etnografia sobre idosos chilenos e a adopção de novas tecnologias como o smartphone, vou falar da alfabetização digital como uma necessidade indispensável no mundo atual. Vou compartilhar alguns resultados do meu trabalho no projeto ASA. Eu fiz 16 meses de trabalho de campo etnográfico em Santiago, Chile, de janeiro de 2018 até maio de 2019. De uma parte, eu trabalhei com migrantes peruanos que ainda não tinham se aposentado e que tinham 60 anos de idade. De uma outra parte, eu fiz campo entre idosos chilenos aposentados de 60 a 80 anos, focalizado no processo de aprendizagem de uso dos smartphones. Vou me concentrar em esta segunda experiência hoje. O objetivo geral do projeto ASA era conhecer a experiência ambivalente da idade no mundo atual, o impacto que pode ter o smartphone nessa experiência e as possíveis consequências para iniciativas públicas de saúde. Com esse objetivo de pesquisa, fiz então trabalho de campo etnográfico em centros culturais para pessoas idosas. Durante mais de um ano, fiz observação participante em cursos de smartphone. De um lado, fui assistente da professora nos cursos regulares, cursos de 25 alunos, 4 encontros em um mês. Cada mês tinha uma nova turma. Vi, então, quase 10 turmas em um ano. De outro lado, eu dei meu próprio curso, onde os alunos podiam vir tanto o que quiser. No final, no meu curso foi uma só turma dos mesmos 20 alunos que vieram todo o ano. A partir disso, entrevistas em profundidade, participação em eventos sociais com eles e assim por diante. Eram cursos de smartphone em geral, WhatsApp, YouTube, Google, a câmera. Marília, entretanto, trabalhou desses 10 meses como voluntária em curso de WhatsApp à frente de 4 turmas, 3 iniciantes e uma intermediária. Geralmente, uma das primeiras coisas que o trabalho etnográfico revela é a diversidade da experiência humana. A mesma coisa acontece com o caso aqui. Como a psicóloga gerontóloga Daniela Tumana disse, não há uma vejez, há vejeces. O que traduzido seria, não tem só uma velhice estándar, tem muitas experiências diversas da velhice. Vários fatores jogam um papel na experiência da idade avançada. A família, a educação, o trabalho, a alimentação, exercício físico, hábitos tóxicos e assim por diante. Vários fatores também afetam a adopção de novas tecnologias pelas pessoas idosas. O uso de tecnologias prévias, familiaridade com o teclado, por exemplo, apoio familiar, assistência técnica de filhos e netos, educação, também, como Marília notou no Brasil, o tempo desde a aposentadoria, motricidade fina nos dedos, capacidade visual e assim por diante. Também é muito importante levar em conta a motivação. Mesmo se encontramos diversidade, um dos motivos mais comuns para aprender o uso do smartphone pelas pessoas idosas era poder usar um aplicativo em particular, o WhatsApp. No Chile, uma aluna de 70 anos que tinha dito que a tecnologia nunca conseguiu me apaixonar, sinalou que só comprou o smartphone porque todas as amigas tinham WhatsApp, então ela ficava fora. A pesquisa Foco Cidadão, do programa Mide Sociedade, sobre o uso da internet pela população chilena, identificou 4 tipos de usuário. O usuário focalizado era aquele que só usava a internet para o uso do WhatsApp exclusivamente. Eram, dentro da pesquisa, os usuários mais idosos, de 55 aos 64 anos. Nas aulas de Marília, de todas as turmas, uma aluna só chegou ao curso sem ter o WhatsApp instalado. Mas também tem diversidade nas dificuldades de adoção do smartphone. As dificuldades mais recorrentes nas nossas experiências no Chile e no Brasil eram, por exemplo, medo de danificar o telefone, pouca paciência com eles mesmos, e mesmo até preconceitos negativos sobre a idade e preconceito das pessoas idosas mesmas, preconceito sobre a suposta incapacidade das pessoas idosas para usar tecnologia. Eu, em geral, encontrava expressões tais como me perdi, o telefone ignora o que eu peço, ou qual dos 20 ícones devo apertar, que resultavam em frustração, ansiedade, mesmo o que eu chamava de falsa tentativa e erro, que era bater na tela do smartphone até o resultado talvez chegar. O padrão geral subjacente lá é a dificuldade de gerenciar uma quantidade excessiva de informação nova na interface. Ícones, navegação da interface, muitas opções, caminhos diversos para o mesmo processo. É preciso conhecer a totalidade da experiência da pessoa idosa para poder compreender o processo de adoção de tecnologia. Fatores sociais, isolamento, perspectivas sobre tecnologia, preocupações sobre a saúde e, fundamentalmente, sobre a autonomia. A aprendizagem do smartphone pode virar uma outra ocasião de dependência dos familiares mais jovens, que geralmente não têm nem a paciência nem a disposição para o ensino. É por isso que é preciso falar da pessoa, não simplesmente do usuário. A experiência do usuário observável quando está com o aparelho não é suficiente para compreender a relação da pessoa com o telefone e com a tecnologia em geral. No entanto, não estamos falando só das pessoas, mas também dos pequenos aparelhinhos que elas têm na mão. Eles também são um fator central nos desafios de adoção de tecnologias. Tanto no Brasil como no Chile, Marília e eu observamos que, em muitos casos, os dispositivos das pessoas idosas agregam eles mesmos dificuldades. São velhos, são geralmente doação de um familiar, têm pouca memória RAM, pouca bateria, a tela não responde bem. O aparelho não tem feita atualização em muito tempo e assim por diante. Além das dificuldades, o ensino do smartphone ao idoso, ou melhor dito, a aprendizagem do smartphone pelo idoso é bem possível. Como professor, é muito gratificante observar nos alunos idosos a capacidade, o entusiasmo, a curiosidade e o processo na aprendizagem. Tudo isso é possível só se certas condições e certas metodologias de ensino são aplicadas. Entre elas, é fundamental o longo prazo. A diferença de aprendizagem, no meu caso, entre as turmas que eu veia passar cada mês e a turma que seguiu todo o ano, foi notável. Uma técnica tão simples como fundamental no Chile e no Brasil era descompor as operações em uma série de passos e permitir aos alunos fazer anotações em papel para se eles formar os seus próprios manuais. Também coordenar os olhares entre a tela do aluno e o quadro do professor. Repetir a explicação quanto que eles precisarem. Fomentar a paciência do aluno com ele mesmo. Em resumo, as condições apontam para uma regulação razoável da informação nova dada. Também muito exercício, aplicação dos aplicativos na vida cotidiana e assim por diante. Assim, o aluno idoso vai perdendo medo e construindo uma autoestima mais forte em relação ao novo aparelho. Estou falando só da autoestima em relação ao aparelho. A vida do idoso é mais do que o smartphone, bem certo. Pensando no contexto mais geral, no tema na reunião de hoje, é importante dizer que as pessoas idosas, tanto no Brasil como no Chile, se encontram na intersecção de duas tendências globais: o envelhecimento da população e a tendência à digitalização dos serviços. O Chile é o país mais digitalizado da América Latina. A taxa de penetração da internet é a mais alta. O Chile é atualmente o país mais bem situado no continente, depois dos Estados Unidos e do Canadá, no índice de competitividade digital. Há muitos anos que tem um sistema de impostos digitalizado e este ano, 2021, vai se aplicar a Lei de Transformação Digital do Estado. Isto quer dizer que para os serviços habituais da administração pública, as pessoas vão precisar saber usar as ferramentas digitais. O mesmo acontece no Brasil com o projeto de lei do governo digital. A crise do Covid-19 deu ainda mais impulso à digitalização. Sem negar as vantagens da digitalização, é preciso dizer que ela pode resultar em uma exclusão não somente digital da pessoa idosa, particularmente, mas mesmo social e de direito. No Brasil, se vemos o uso da internet por faixa etária, na faixa de 60 anos e mais, é só 34%. No Chile, em 2018, segundo a pesquisa da Subsecretaria de Telecomunicações, 49% das pessoas de 60 anos e mais nunca tinham usado internet. Então, tem a materialidade, mas não tem o uso. Lamentavelmente, não tem programa suficiente de alfabetização digital para prover conhecimento necessário para o uso. Esta situação, materialidade disponível na forma de redes, aparelhos, conexões, a promessa do 5G e a falta de conhecimento para a utilização, parece reproduzir os problemas da noção de brecha digital. Há quase 20 anos, Mark Warshauer, no seu livro Technology and Social Inclusion, Rethinking the Digital Divide, criticou a noção de brecha digital. O autor sinalou que o problema dessa noção é que parece implicar uma divisão abismal entre quem tem aparelho e quem não tem, como se fosse o acesso ao aparelho e as conexões suficiente para fechar o gap. É importante dizer que o autor também reconhece o valor histórico da noção para instalar o problema na esfera pública nos Estados Unidos. Talvez seja útil para isso no Chile e no Brasil. No entanto, é muito importante lembrar que com o acesso aos dispositivos não é suficiente. A alfabetização digital de pessoas idosas é um caminho longo, mas é possível e mesmo necessário. Segundo Van Dijk e Van Duursen, este caminho começa apenas com as habilidades digitais operacionais, o bottom knowledge, mas continua progressivamente com as habilidades digitais formais, as habilidades digitais de informação, as habilidades digitais de comunicação, de criação de conteúdo, até chegar ao último passo. As habilidades digitais estratégicas, quando a pessoa se apropria da tecnologia, da informação e da comunicação e faz um uso pessoal e criativo dos aplicativos, como, por exemplo, o uso de WhatsApp para a saúde. É só nesse momento que atingimos o objetivo da alfabetização digital, quando a pessoa se apropria das tecnologias e as usa criativamente para o que ela quiser. Porque o objetivo, ao final, não é a inclusão digital, não. É a inclusão social. E o smartphone virou uma ferramenta necessária para isso. Porque, ao final, nestes tempos de envelhecimento da população e digitalização quase forçada, a apropriação das ferramentas digitais tornou-se um pré-requisito indispensável para o pleno exercício da cidadania. Muito obrigado pela atenção.
Muito obrigado, Alfonso. Então, a gente passa a palavra agora para a professora Marília Duque, e, na sequência, a gente faz uma rodada de perguntas com os três palestrantes, com o professor Daniel Miller, o professor Alfonso e com a professora Marília. Para isso, eu vou pedir que as pessoas que tenham perguntas postem no chat, e aí a gente consegue organizar. Se alguém quiser mandar a pergunta diretamente para mim, também, e não quiser postar para todos no chat, fiquem à vontade. Marília, por favor, adiante.
Obrigada, Luiz e SPM, por organizar o evento. Obrigada, Daniel, por estar aqui com a gente, e obrigada, Afonso, que foi meu grande parceiro aí durante a pesquisa, e obrigada em particular pelo seu esforço de falar hoje em português. Ficou perfeito. Eu vou começar, então, a minha apresentação. Vocês estão conseguindo ver a tela?
Sim.
Sim, legal. Eu vou retomar a fala do Afonso e de que a inclusão digital ela é mais do que isso, ela passa a ser uma inclusão social, quando as habilidades requeridas dos usuários elas passam a ser pré-requisito para o exercício da cidadania. E eu vou focar especificamente no acesso à saúde a partir da perspectiva da minha etnografia, que foi num bairro de classe média em São Paulo. No Brasil, a pandemia ela resultou não só na aprovação em caráter emergencial da telemedicina, mas também na aposta em certos aplicativos que passaram a mediar e ocupar posição central no acesso à saúde por parte do cidadão. Lembrando, né, que nesse contexto a população idosa foi a mais vitimada, principalmente no começo da pandemia. No caso do Brasil, foram feitas duas apostas importantes, uma o aplicativo Coronavírus SUS e outro o Conect SUS. Para se ter uma ideia da efetividade desses aplicativos, o Coronavírus SUS, por exemplo, teve 61,5 milhões de downloads desde o lançamento, mas em fevereiro desse ano possui apenas 2,3 milhões de usuários ativos, né? Isso é menos de 1% da população brasileira. Para entender por que um acesso que passa a ser mediado por smartphones é eficiente ou não, é necessário entender a centralidade do dispositivo como acesso exclusivo, principalmente na população 60 anos ou mais, que é de quem eu vou tratar especificamente hoje. Nesse caso, 65% das pessoas com 60 anos ou mais no Brasil acessam a internet exclusivamente via celular. E eu só posso falar, eu só posso questionar, por exemplo, a efetividade de um aplicativo como Coronavírus SUS a partir da minha etnografia, que é anterior à pandemia. Né? Eu trabalhei de fevereiro a maio de 2019, 16 meses também, como Afonso e como os outros pesquisadores do grupo. Nesse período, já existiam outras iniciativas, tanto na esfera pública quanto na privada, que usavam aplicativos para mediar o acesso à saúde e a comunicação com provedores de saúde. Entre elas, para os participantes da minha pesquisa, 3 eram relevantes. Uma é o aplicativo Agenda Fácil, que é de acesso ao SUS e é criado foi criado aqui especificamente pela Prefeitura de São Paulo, e outros dois, que seria o aplicativo de saúde suplementar do Plano Prevent Senior e o aplicativo do Doutor Consulta, que é uma clínica que você paga conforme vai usando os serviços. Eu vou dar um passo para trás para contextualizar isso dentro do projeto global, tá? Quando nós começamos a pesquisa de campo, a gente tinha uma expectativa de que, a partir do entendimento do contexto cultural e das condições de uso e apropriações dos smartphones, quando eu digo nós, não só eu e Afonso e o Daniel Miller, mas todos os pesquisadores do grupo, nós tínhamos uma expectativa de que a gente poderia, de certa forma, contribuir ou para a melhoria de serviços ou para o desenvolvimento de serviços em parceria com desenvolvedores e políticas públicas. E a gente tinha uma expectativa de que isso se daria a partir do desenvolvimento de aplicativos específicos de saúde. Mas quando a gente foi a campo, agora falando especificamente do Brasil, a minha constatação foi que o uso de aplicativos de saúde, aplicativos de monitoramento, eles não eram relevantes para os participantes. Eu convivi com quase 400 idosos, entrevistei 38, desses 38, 8 possuíam aplicativos, mas usaram o que eu chamei de uso ativo, né, de interagir com o aplicativo e de considerar os feedbacks para uma melhoria de saúde, ela é apenas um usuário, né? E aí teve uma preocupação que era não só dele, mas constante, que era a preocupação de manter a autonomia e não ser um fardo para os filhos. Mas eu vou voltar na interface com provedores de serviços de saúde, né? No caso da Agenda Fácil, só um participante tinha instalado. Ele não teve problemas com a interface, mas ele tinha problemas com a integração no sistema, porque frequentemente o uso do aplicativo era bloqueado, porque os pedidos que eram feitos não eram atualizados no sistema, e tive a experiência de uma segunda usuária que tentou fazer o download e o setup do aplicativo para uso, mas não conseguiu e abandonou o uso. No caso da Prevent Senior, a relevância desse plano é importante porque 13 idosos que fizeram downgrade no plano de saúde suplementar depois da aposentadoria escolheram a Prevent Senior. E para eles, o aplicativo da Prevent Senior é altamente confuso. Ele fica reduzido ao papel de ser uma carteirinha digital de identificação do usuário, mas quando eles precisam consultar a rede ou marcar uma consulta, eles migram ou para o telefone ou para o site. Lembrando que essa parcela específica, ela é uma parcela de poder aquisitivo mais alto e, por isso, como até se refletem nas pesquisas, ela é uma parcela multidispositivos. Então, ela pode se dar ao luxo de passar para o site, por exemplo, para marcar uma consulta. No caso do Doutor Consulta, 4 participantes eram usuários, mas nenhum possuía o aplicativo para agendamento ou para consulta. Eles também migravam ou para o telefone ou para o site. Então, o que eu consegui observar, né? Uma baixa relevância do uso de aplicativos que se destinam à saúde e uma usabilidade ruim. As barreiras principais foram o download e setup de novos aplicativos e a usabilidade da interface. Mas eu queria destacar um pouco a questão do download e setup de novos aplicativos. Por exemplo, quando o Ministério da Saúde ele desenvolve 2 aplicativos que passam a ocupar uma posição central na gestão da saúde dos cidadãos em contexto de pandemia, a gente tem que considerar que, especificamente no caso da população idosa, geralmente quem faz o download e setup de novos aplicativos são familiares, amigos e vizinhos. Considerando que estamos, né, todos em um contexto de isolamento social ou de distanciamento físico, como preferir, o que a gente está dizendo é que nessa situação emergencial específica, esse download e setup ficam ainda mais prejudicados. Então, você pode estar criando ferramentas para a gestão de saúde quando, na verdade, a condição para o download e setup para uso, ele fica inviabilizado pelo próprio cenário de pandemia. E aí aqui eu tenho, né, um relato de uma das participantes que fala, né, que, olha, ela me descreveu durante muitos minutos as funcionalidades de um aplicativo, mas quando ela foi me mostrar o aplicativo, que foi um procedimento que todos os pesquisadores do grupo fizeram, que é literalmente pedir para as pessoas abrirem os aplicativos um a um e explicarem o que usam e o que não usam, o aplicativo nunca tinha sido usado. E aí ela explica que, olha, eu tive uma dificuldade, né, nessa época anterior à pandemia, mas eu marquei uma reunião com o desenvolvedor, porque eu quero que ele me explique como faz, porque eu quero usar, porque eu sei que aqui tem coisas que me interessam, mas eu não consigo. Ao mesmo tempo, a gente observou uma oportunidade, que era a apropriação do WhatsApp para a saúde em usos informais e usos institucionais. Então, nos usos informais, a gente viu a criação de grupos de familiares para cuidar de pais idosos, a gente viu as dinâmicas de família transnacional, né? Tanto eu aqui, porque São Paulo ele também, né, é um polo migratório, tanto dos que vieram, né, grande parte dos participantes da minha pesquisa, eles mesmos são migrantes que vieram trabalhar em São Paulo, ou são filhos e seus filhos já estão em outros lugares, da mesma forma que o Afonso observou, como que o WhatsApp ele passa a intermediar a comunicação dos peruanos que vivem em Santiago com suas famílias de origem, né? E aqui entra um pouco a questão que o Daniel Miller colocou antes, né? Que essa morte da distância, né? Ou essa coisa de que você pode, pelo telefone, estarmos todos na mesma mesa de jantar, mesmo que cada um esteja num canto diferente. E no caso do Brasil, aqui de São Paulo, eu também observei um largo uso de WhatsApp para acesso de informações e troca de informações de saúde entre amigos, e a troca de favores, quando eles precisam de alguma coisa, de um acompanhante para um exame, tudo isso passa a ser mediado pelo WhatsApp, e também um acesso a informações de saúde via rede de relacionamentos. Então, se eles não têm acesso ao WhatsApp do médico, eles vão procurar na rede de contatos os amigos que trabalham na área da saúde. Então, eles vão ter uma informação que, ao mesmo tempo, é profissional, mas vem de uma esfera informal. E usos institucionais. Então, entre profissionais, médicos, né, entre consultas para validar, discutir procedimentos, resultados, etc., entre provedores e pacientes e clientes. Então, o próprio plano Prevent Senior, ele não dá, o médico não fornece o WhatsApp, mas eles criaram um WhatsApp da especialidade médica, então o usuário passa a ter contato com ele. E dentro dessa mediação do WhatsApp, especificamente o papel das enfermeiras. Então, o Afonso ele trabalhou num hospital oncológico de rede pública em Santiago, onde as 5 enfermeiras gerenciavam cada uma cerca de 150 pacientes. Então, o tempo com o médico é altamente reduzido, mas a enfermeira entra para fazer uma gestão do tratamento, para a educação, e também para, quando a gente fala, né, a navegadora, né, também para ajudar o paciente a navegar, tanto pelo tratamento quanto pelas burocracias do sistema de saúde. No meu caso, eu também pude observar esse papel, essa função, numa clínica particular em São Paulo, que também centraliza toda a gestão do tratamento do paciente via enfermeiras no WhatsApp. Isso fez com que a gente fizesse uma mudança de perspectiva, né? Vamos dizer, a nossa contribuição aplicada, a gente tinha uma perspectiva que a gente ia agregar ao que os desenvolvedores e gestores de política pública estavam fazendo, a partir de um conhecimento de longo, né, prazo, uma etnografia de longo prazo de 16 meses, então a gente traria insights e achados sobre, olha, quais são, desde o que essa população considera saudável, quais são as táticas adotadas por eles para a gestão da saúde, e a nossa expectativa inicial era de contribuir com essa inteligência, né? Mas a gente não só continuou fazendo isso, mas a gente também adotou uma perspectiva empática com relação ao meio. Então, a gente não só passou a ter um conhecimento sobre a gestão da saúde localmente, mas a gente também identificou que, ao invés de propor o desenvolvimento de um novo aplicativo, seria mais eficiente fazer propostas a partir do meio do aplicativo que as pessoas já usavam. E nesse caso, principalmente em Santiago e no Brasil, o meio principal seria o WhatsApp. Disso resultaram algumas entregas aplicadas. Eu acabei, a partir da observação do ecossistema de saúde em São Paulo e de como o WhatsApp era usado, eu desenvolvi um protocolo de comunicação para hospitais e clínicas médicas, em parceria com a Unifesp, com o setor de estudo de envelhecimento. Eu desenvolvi uma outra aplicação de WhatsApp para a saúde, e no contexto de pandemia, eu desenvolvi um projeto chamado Antes no WhatsApp, que visava justamente acompanhar os idosos que não conseguissem acesso a esses canais de informações oficiais, como, por exemplo, o aplicativo Coronavírus SUS. No caso do Afonso, ele está trabalhando em particular com esse papel das enfermeiras, ajudando a otimizar o trabalho de utilização do WhatsApp para essa navegação e para essa assistência com os pacientes. Uma outra coisa interessante é que tanto eu quanto Afonso, a gente esbarra num impedimento legal. Então, o fato do WhatsApp ser prioritariamente usado, né, como, vamos dizer assim, um meio intuitivo para a gestão de saúde, quando a gente fala, então vamos usar esse meio em estratégias institucionais e em serviços, esbarra no impedimento legal de gestão de dados, de consentimento. No caso do Afonso, ele observou isso, por exemplo, no hospital onde ele trabalhou, essas enfermeiras, que eu vou lembrar, né, que elas gerenciam em torno de 150 pacientes, elas fazem isso usando o smartphone. Então, o Afonso propôs, por exemplo, que o hospital instalasse o WhatsApp Web, que poderia tornar a experiência das enfermeiras e a produtividade das enfermeiras muito maior, mas houve uma negação do departamento legal, porque apesar de se saber claramente que o WhatsApp é o aplicativo que faz essa mediação, quando se propõe para que ele seja de fato considerado e melhorado, isso esbarra no departamento legal. Da mesma forma, eu aqui, que visitei com meu protocolo de comunicação para hospitais, um hospital em São Paulo, que é o hospital especializado no atendimento de idosos, referenciados pela rede pública, e houve todo o interesse na implementação e teste desses protocolos, até que se esbarrou também no impedimento legal. Não trabalhamos, não podemos instalar o WhatsApp no hospital. E eu queria ressaltar um ponto, que é o seguinte: sim, o WhatsApp tem problemas de termos de uso, de gestão de dados, mas o argumento de que um aplicativo de saúde desenvolvido especificamente para determinado fim não garante que ele não tenha os mesmos problemas. Então, por exemplo, numa pesquisa recente, com 13 aplicativos integrados no sistema eGov no Brasil, 6 ou não pedem consentimento ou utilizam dados para além do necessário para a prestação de serviço. Então, o que eu estou ponderando não é que o WhatsApp não tenha problemas, mas o que eu estou dizendo é que o desenvolvimento de um novo aplicativo não necessariamente soluciona isso, né? Mais práticas podem ocorrer dos dois lados. Mas eu queria terminar a fala falando de um exemplo de boa prática, né? O WhatsApp Solidário, ele foi criado pela Coordenação de Políticas para Pessoas Idosas da Secretaria de Direitos Humanos e Cidadania aqui em São Paulo. Ele é um aplicativo que viabilizou o acolhimento e a participação em atividades físicas, artísticas, educativas, musicais, além de apoio psicológico. E eu queria destacar que assim, a implementação desse serviço dentro das políticas públicas foi feita em 7 dias após a declaração desse estado de pandemia e as medidas de distanciamento físico. Ele teve a adesão imediata de 200 idosos. Por quê? Porque não foi necessário nem o desenvolvimento de um novo aplicativo, nem a adoção de uma nova tecnologia por esse público. E eu queria encerrar chamando a atenção que imagina que depois de um ano de pandemia, imagina o impacto se, nesse exemplo, né, em uma semana se criou uma iniciativa, imagina o impacto de um ano de pandemia se uma alternativa usando o WhatsApp fosse implementada a cada 7 dias. Eu acho que essa é a contribuição principal na parte da saúde que o projeto visa fazer, que é como olhar, identificar e observar o que as pessoas já usam e como ser empático com esses meios, a fim não só de otimizar recursos, mas de diminuir barreiras de adoção de tecnologia e fazer com que mais pessoas se beneficiem de iniciativas como essa. Obrigada.
Muito obrigado, Marília. Vou colocar agora aqui no ponto central. Just let me invite all the speakers to the ground floor, and I collect some questions. So I have one set of questions, the first round, to all of you three. Juliana, she asked about fake news and disinformation. Have you had faced the discussion of medical information through internet, or have you had discussed critical use of the information through the participants? There's also one question to Professor Miller about the idea of perpetual opportunism. What are the findings from the field that change what we already knew about the culture of connectivity? For all of you, a question on surveillance. So it seems that there is 2 different poles. On one side, the idea of culture of surveillance, where the users or the people are fighting for their agents, and on the other pole, there is a losing battle. There's no agents or the losing agents under the capitalism surveillance. If you can discuss these ideas, and to Alfonso in particular, if you can detail a little bit more about this beautiful idea of the patient that the old students, they need to have with themselves in the middle of the mediatization of the neoliberal ideology that everything must be active, everything must be fast. So sorry for my misspelling, for my worst Spanglish. You can answer in Spanish, English, Portuguese. The important is the message. Please.
Okay.
I
would
think
advise perhaps to focus on one question at the time, perhaps read one, reply, and then...
I think that we could start answering about fake news, and I think that we could focus on fake news regarding health, and maybe Daniel could start talking a little bit about Googling for health, and then me and Afonso, we add from our fieldworks. Can we do that? I think it's...
Sure. Do you want to start, Marília, with fake news itself? Because you were looking at that a bit in Brazil.
Yeah. We have like a fake news itself that is circulated that older people are the part of the population that share fake news the most. I could observe how fake news are shared among WhatsApp groups, but there is no, like as scientists, we can just pick up a finding that was done in another context and use it here. And that was, for example, what the Brazilian media did at that time. But it's true. In my case, older people, I don't know why I'm speaking English, but okay. In my case, older people, my participants, they do have a difference for authority, and in particular for medical authority. So for example, we could observe the same structure of fake news. It also use a reference and authority. And when it comes to the WhatsApp groups, older people are more likely to share news. They are more likely to share news that are based on medical authority. But meanwhile, they are also developing skills to check if it's true or not. So one of the biggest bad moments that older people could experience in the WhatsApp groups is when someone shares fake news, because someone will check if it's true or not, and we'll go back to the group like public scrutination and say, you should have seen this before. So they are gaining the skills to check fake news, but there is still a large presence of fake news, especially related to health.
Okay, so thank you, Marilia. I mean, one of the things that I think makes our project different is that, I mean, you know, there is all these debates about fake news, particularly with respect to politics in the media all the time, but you're asking about health. And actually, by doing this ethnographically, you could kind of see a bigger picture. So one of the things I was concentrating on was maybe the biggest use of all of smartphones for health, which is simply to Google health information. Because at least where I am, everybody does this. They're constantly, as soon as you get a symptom, a rash, anything, you go to what we call Dr. Google and you ask Dr. Google, you know, am I going to get cancer? What is it? Was this serious or not serious, etc. Now, by studying this more systematically, the conclusion of the work was perhaps not expected. What we argued is that the effect, at least in Ireland, is it actually exacerbates differences of class. And the reason is this: although the same information is out there, people who've been to university, they have experience of research, they have often a good idea, you know, which things to take notice of, which to reject. They may use it to delve into actually like the medical papers. And if they're already well informed, they're probably going to get even better informed if they Google for health. But for other people who do not have that experience, who are not familiar with research, they will just look at the first thing they come to, the top of Google. And at least before COVID, that tended to be either commercial sites that were selling them something, or sites that were like expressing anxiety. Yes, you know, even if you have a small thing, it's definitely going to be cancer. So effectively, they became more anxious, they became less informed, and it was one of the most problematic effects of the use of smartphone in relation to health. But this is, I would say, this is what we get if we actually study this in terms of the population of users, rather than simply, oh, you know, the newspapers have this or that fake news item, which they kind of highlight. So I think, yes, we certainly would have a contribution to make there, but not necessarily the expected one.
Let me just add one. Sorry.
No, just one a little. Okay, go ahead. No, go ahead.
No, you go.
Okay, just to contribute on my experience dealing with fake news. So usually form WhatsApp group with older people, older adults. And at what point during the pandemic, not the ongoing pandemic, they started to share fake news. So I then decided to intervene, mostly before there were fake news, but so to speak, they were like harmless, like a video of a boy dancing with an older woman and saying, look, this is the president of France dancing with his wife when he was a child, or look at this dragon, animated dragon in South Korea, which was clearly CGI. When they started to share fake news on the pandemic, like drink this tea and you will be protected, something like, I decided to intervene to debunk this fake news. What was important is that actually one of the digital skills that go in like a hierarchical level, like in the further step, the information skills, is the ability to decide which is useful information and what is not. And what was surprising is that many of the people who share fake news were people who had college degrees. But when I asked them then in private, why did you share that? Did you take the information? Is because they trusted the source, who was a friend, a fellow friend, journalist or something. So I didn't pursue that research further. And then when I started debunking, I changed the dynamic of the group and people started to share, to check with me if that was true or not. Sorry, I just heard this. Is this true, this Bill Gates chip or not? And I say no for this and for that, and trying to give, trying to continue the workshop, the smartphone workshop, teaching them information skills, how to debunk, how to check for information. Well, so that was surprising. So they actually trusted the source. It was a close friend. And so that was my little experience in my fieldwork. Sorry, Marila, go ahead.
No, just to add that the same occurs in Brazil. The source, if it's a person that people trust, this content is more likely to be shared. But I just want to highlight that that's not specifically of older people. Like 23% of Brazilians do that. So they consider the source, the person who shared it first, the main criteria to share or not a content. And I just want to add something more to what Daniel said about Googling for health, because in my case, even participants with high education consider that internet can be scary when they are searching for health content. But in my case, it was interesting because the deference to medical authority drove them to leave the internet and search for friends that are friends of friends that work in the health area within their WhatsApp groups. So they start looking for health information in Google and they go look for health information among their friends that work in health area and that have the kind of information that they trust, because they do trust the medical authority.
Thank you. So just to refresh, the other questions were related with the perpetual opportunism.
Yeah. And I think it was the questions, particularly if I remember, about connectivity.
Yes, which is the difference between perpetual opportunism and the culture of connected. And
again, I guess that what's interesting is that in our research, we often see sort of bigger results out of this, because the starting point is simply that it's available. And because it's available, you're always conscious that at any time you can do all these things with a smartphone. That is what makes perpetual opportunism. And one of the examples of that certainly is connectivity with people. And that can matter in a number of ways. I'll give two examples. One is that in studies of how people care at a distance, let's say you cannot be with your elderly parent during the pandemic, you're locked down and they are somewhere else. You often find that it's not so much what you say to them, it's the frequency that you're in contact with them. In the Japanese case, Laura talks about sending little bits of nothing. But the fact that you're using this opportunity to contact them again and again and again is what's really reassuring sometimes to an elderly parent in their 90s that you actually care about them. And that's kind of one example. The second example came from something that I know is also true for in Brazil from Marília, is we're looking at the changes in the way family operates and family communications. And one of the points is that if you just see people very occasionally, your family kind of ends up being mainly a nuclear family, and the rest of the family have become, you know, more people you can see very occasionally well, in Ireland it tends to be funerals, probably in Brazil more weddings, I don't know. But if you are on a WhatsApp group and you're like constantly opportunistic, you see something and you're growing up with your cousins, and you can just, even if they're no longer living, you know, in the same area, you can just constantly be in touch with them. Even the very kind of nature, informality of your communication actually varies. So you have perpetual opportunism. Then you have a question about how does it affect social connectivity? And that in turn has consequences for care, for family, and also for many other areas, which again is always why this smartphone is so important.
Thank you. Moving forward, the other questions were related with the agents of the people or the users and the idea of surveillance and care. If you could go deeper, all of you, about that, or if you want to add something.
So Marília, you're muted. Marília, you're muted.
I think this question has much to do with the point that Daniel raised, that you can think agents about what you can do with the smartphone gives you. So, but what we found is that at the same time that people are trying to manage the things that are imposed, they are also doing another side of personalization. So I think, Daniel, that maybe you could talk more about that and about the point that you raised earlier.
So I'm not sure what you mean, but certainly in relation to surveillance, yeah, I mean, I think this is something that people's concern with surveillance can come from two different directions. It can sort of be top down or bottom up. It can be top down, they're constantly reading things from academics, and somebody, I think the question I mentioned, you know, the effects of capitalism, and they're worried about what the corporations know about them. And I mean, one of the curious contradictions about surveillance is that certainly when I was researching, I found that a lot of the surveillance by, as it were, capitalism is to create targeted advertising, right? So, they worked out that you might want to buy this object. And so they put out an advert. And from the point of view of the user of the smartphone, it's like, how did they know that I wanted that, right? So funnily enough, that then is the evidence that people have that this surveillance is a problem. And in some ways, I suspect that it may actually cause more problem for the companies than actually give them sales. I'm not at all sure that this is as positive as commerce actually thinks it is. Less, you know, we are also concerned with kind of the more sort of background surveillance where data is being, as they say, mined and used by the companies, but that's not something people tend to experience so immediately. They don't have experiences of harm that come directly from kind of aggregate collections of data. So that's more something they read about, but it's not at the front of their minds. It's more the things that they see that actually affect them that concern. But it depends, because one of the points I made when I was talking about care and surveillance is that this is partly just the ideology of peoples around the world. I mean, in very general terms, people in East Asia or maybe in some parts of Canada, you're more accepting of, for example, state surveillance, because you're prepared to see if you're prepared to see the state as looking after your welfare in the way they might in Korea or they might in Taiwan. Whereas in other countries, US, etc., they are very, very suspicious because there is almost an obsessive concern with individual privacy as a human right, as a liberal right. So the issue about surveillance is to really understand it in the context of the different populations, but also there are many different kinds of surveillance that people might be concerned with. And often it's the one that it becomes actually apparent to them when they're actually using the smartphone that matters.
And I think that one nice contribution that the project did is that when we talk about surveillance and care, we usually focus on the relationship between state and citizens and companies and users. But another point that the project raised is like also the line between surveillance and care, like in personal relationships. So for example, children that use the geolocalization of their parents' smartphones to know where they are, and these allow them like it facilitates that they can still living alone at their homes. So I guess that one of the nice contributions that the project did is to bring this point about the surveillance and care to personal relationships. So how people are dealing with this dilemma of when care stops and starts surveillance, but how are the damage and the benefits for the care of the family and for personal relationships? I think it's another perspective that the project brings.
We are on time, but I think that if Alfonso can answer the question related with the paradox of the speed and from the students being care.
Yes, I remember the question. So I reply briefly on the surveillance question and reply on the patients.
I will read, if you allow me, there is these remain questions and another two. I just give to you these three questions, and then we can close. So this question was how, if you can go deeper on the patients that old students, they had to develop with themselves in the context that aging is mediatized on the way that they can't lose weight, lose time, and so on. So this kind of paradox, and the question also mixes up with the ideology of neoliberalism, that everything must be fast, and how to do that with, trying to teach people to calm down and try to deal with that. And our colleague Sandra Rubia from the Federal University of Santa Maria asked one question about the barriers to use smartphones as a citizenship. If you navigate through these questions, some barriers to use smartphones as a citizenship tool. And also Laura Reis, I don't know, my Spanish pronunciation is faster and mix up with Portuguese. So she is wondering to know if you involved WhatsApp company in the discussion of the findings and the analysis that you did. So these three final questions.
Okay, so I will reply slowly or fast. I don't know. But well, to reply on the surveillance from a teaching perspective. So usually one of the fears was, am I going to break the phone but just touching it? And another one was, I am going to be followed or on some kind. And even though we get to a point when they want to learn to use Google Maps, and you have to explain first, which is a GPS system, which you have to activate the GPS feature. And there are some people more concerned about that, like one student who always had the GPS disabled, has the front camera covered with tape because he saw Mark Zuckerberg do it. He was 77 years old, and he showed me once a message from Google Maps. He was terrified. He said, Google Maps had said, you were in this park for 3 hours. Can you write a review about it? So, and these are legit concerns. And so it was part of his general personality of not trusting people, saying that people could rob me, and he was robbed, so he thought it was to do with Google Maps. So there is extreme cases. Many people are concerned, but usually it's a balance between usefulness and what you give, as we all face, but also represents an ethical choice when teaching. because as you know, it's not only button knowledge to, okay, activate GPS, or okay, point, go to, use Google Maps. It's about informed choice, that something is analyzing your information and trying to explain that it's an algorithm, not a person, but it's going to be important for some person sometime. So most people were balancing the usefulness of the feature and what you give as a privacy, but it was an ethical choice from the teaching perspective, because I needed to teach not only operational skills, but also informational and strategic skills, which are a much higher level. So they had this concern, but in general, they okay, I'm going to use it anyway. So when it comes to patients, so it's important to patient with themselves. It's important to remember that older adults, when they came to learn to use this smartphone, even if they're interested in technology, it comes it's not unusual that it's a forced decision, that you have to use this smartphone because you have to communicate with your doctor, with friends, with the states, etc. So they have certain anxiety, and even though they like to learn, when you have been a professional your whole life, finding yourself at the elementary level again, it's quite frustrating. And another factor is the resources. I was teaching to 25 students with just one whiteboard and a marker, and 25 students, out of which 24 have Android phones, each Android phone with a different software skin. So the screenshot is done this way here, this way here, this way here. So it took a long time to build trust between each student, to have patience for each other. So they would wait for me to go and teach one student in particular, while the rest kept practicing, because there are limited resources. In my course, they could come all year long, so there was no problem. But in other, usually regular courses, you just have 4 shots at talking to the professor, to the teacher. So you have to take advantage. It's a competence for the time. So, and it's actually one of the things they realized, what they lack patience towards themselves. And I usually like to try to use humor to ease up the tension, the frustration, and to say these older adults nowadays, they cannot wait. They want everything now. So I will just spend the first step, and they were making questions about the 4th and the 5th. So it took a while, it took patience. And when it comes to neoliberal productivity times, well, it has to do with resources, because the municipalities need to have impact. That's why they couldn't allow students to repeat the course each month. So they have to say, after 1 year, we have 400 older adults did the course, not just 40, but they know really well how to use WhatsApp. They can do that. But we have, this tendency like slow food, slow academia meetings. So it's kind of, I think, as everything perhaps can be resolved with a certain type of branding. Like we need to perhaps slow down to learn. But it actually, as I say, it's all year long. It's the long time commitment that allows the older students to be patient toward the other, but toward themselves. And understand that I try, one of the things, and just I'm close with this, is I said today, blame the phone now and then. It's bad design. If you can do it like in 2 steps, it's not your fault. It's WhatsApp. Imagine like driving a car, and every 2 months with an update, now the driving wheel is now down here, because it's fun. And now the steering, the accelerator, now we move it right here. So you do it like this. Something like that, it was happening for them with every update that you have to do with WhatsApp or with Google, etc. So that is my reply. Thank you.
So the barriers to citizenship, I think that you highlighted in all the answers, but if you want to add something related with that, the barriers to use smartphones as a citizenship or a way to get through citizenship.
I mean, I guess this came up with the issues of digital divide, but of course I couldn't quite hear what was being discussed there. Does anyone want to say more about that?
Alfonso.
No, please go ahead, Marilia. I already talked like for 6 minutes.
I think that along Alfonso's presentation, when he addressed the the project to the digitalization of all the state service, and the same in Brazil, that we have a similar project. And I think that this is the main case when smartphones will become the mediator, and the digital skills will be the citizenship skills. So to access service, to make interface with the state, or to access health or transportation or anything else, day by day, it's becoming more digitalized. And the problem is that, for example, in the Brazilian project, you have like a specific thing saying that presential service will be provided to particular population that needs it, but we are not sure about the efficiency of that, because the main mean to communicate with state and to access the provision of care or any other basic service will be mediated by internet and the smartphone.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's discussed in our book is that the experience of the state is contradictory, because on the one hand, actually, so many of the states keep warning older people about the dangers of smartphones. Oh, you're going to be addicted. It's taking your privacy. And older people get very concerned about that. So, for example, in the Italian state is considering passing a law curbing the use of smartphones, etc. And yet the very same governments now make it almost impossible to do anything without going through the digital and smartphones. So, you know, for older people, it's like, what do I do? On the one hand, they're telling me I shouldn't be using this. On the other hand, they're saying I've got to be using this. And they kind of feel stuck in the middle. I did have a point to make about this experience of time, which I think was being asked about. I'm not sure, but do I have time to make the point? Are we still okay for a minute? Yeah, yes. Okay. So I just thought I'd make something, a very different point, because it's good, I think, if we talk about things that maybe we didn't expect or controversial, because there is a general assumption, I think, that, you know, young people are getting busier and busier, and the smartphone is part of this kind of speeding up of society. More pressure, more things, etc., etc. Whereas, you know, you think older people, they're wanting to sort of relax a bit more, take things easy, do things more slowly. And certainly there are many older people, in the sense the people Alfonso was talking about, I think that would quite possibly be the case. But just to give a counter example, I worked with these older people in Ireland, and actually the main reason that they were under so much pressure was because usually the pressures of work or of looking after family. The really busy person was the housewife who you know, has 2 children to somehow care for, and also is at full-time work. When they come to retirement, and also when the children are older, actually people have a good deal more time. But the subtitle of our book is When Life Becomes Craft, because what I found is these people, they don't have to be busy, but they really are busy. They just do so many different activities. They volunteer for many charitable things. They have a very active social life. They start learning all sorts of new kind of arts and interests and education. And I mean, you can't speak to them because they don't have any time to actually kind of talk to you. And actually, for them, the smartphone is central because it's now become the way they organize their own life as a kind of craft. So the point I'm making is that as anthropologists, you can't overgeneralize. There are the people who feel very intimidated by and actually don't want to be involved in that way. And there are the people who actually just want to experience as much life as they can in retirement. And the smartphone is actually great, because actually they can do more and they can do it more quickly. And they don't see any downside to that. That's what they want. And that's very much part of, so if you read our book, you will find that constantly we're trying to show that for every generalization people make, we have to say, it depends who you're talking about. It's not just older versus younger, it's also which group of older people we're referring to, because there will always be this complete spectrum of answers depending on that particular group.
Can I reply shortly on citizenship? So just to retake both answers, yes, it's based on this loss of digital transformation of the state. Also in Chile, there will be exception for people who will be allowed to do some bureaucracy on paper, but it's very, very exceptional. And actually, according to the Subsecretary of Telecommunications, 89% of access to internet in Chile is done through the smartphone. So the smartphone is going to be the device older people are going to use. But as Danny remarked, they're also the unexpected. So for example, and it's not only the transformation of the state, it's paying the bills, is usually, as in the last years, is done through the smartphones, through internet. And actually, a student have told me, yeah, but actually, we like to do the queue and talk to people while we pay our bills, because that's an opportunity for socializing. Many people attend these cultural centers as a way to socialize. And for example, last year during the pandemic, I followed up a couple of my former students. And for example, one widower who lives alone and who knows how to use properly the smartphone and stuff, for him, social life took place when he was going to buy bread, when he was going to buy the newspaper. So these little interactions allow for social life for some of the older people, not everyone. And sometimes service that the digital transformation of the state is a service that I'm sure is going to be efficient, but sometimes perhaps it's going to be so efficient it might not be good. As an example from David Pendergast, anthropologist who works in Ireland, there was like a service designed for older people with dementia, which was a sort of Uber Eats. They sent food to people, older people with dementia living at home. The problem was actually better to leave these people prepare the food themselves. So they had a recipe printed on paper and followed the steps. So it was an exercise. So sometimes too efficient is not good. And some of it might be replicated with this transformation of the state's laws, at least concerning some of the older people, not everyone, as Daniel said and Marilia highlighted.
So thank you. We are over time. So I'm assuming that there was no involvement of WhatsApp on your research.
No involvement. I mean, for example, I have never had a contact with any relevant company, and I've never done a consultancy. So I have absolutely zero relationship to any of these companies. I've never met them.
So thank you so much for your time and for being here. We had more than 60 attendants. Now people are just getting out of the room. So before that, just please answer o questionário de satisfação que está no chat. And agora tem também, vocês podem pegar o seu smartphone e utilizar o código QR que está na tela para responder à pesquisa de satisfação. Thank you so much for being here, Professor Daniel Miller, Professor Alfonso, and Professor Marilia. Hope to see you as soon as we can face-to-face in São Paulo at ESPM. Okay? Please, thank you. Have a nice day, and thank you for all the attendance.
Thank you.
Have a nice day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Muito obrigado. Thank you very much.
Obrigado.